Chapter 13. On March 1st, Cheryl and I moved into our very own home. By March 2nd, most of our furniture and appliances had been delivered. The following Saturday, I gave a housewarming party, but only Roger came. Cheryl refused to invite Nancy or any of her other friends. Next, Cheryl and I went looking for a car. It was wonderful to have money to be able to pay cash for a car. The salesman really catered to us, even offered us a two-car deal, but Cheryl absolutely refused my offer to buy her own car. I really wanted a big, expensive luxury car, but because of Cheryl, I bought a little Datsun, which I never did like very much, not after the Radcliffe's automobiles. Cheryl asked me again in that accusing manner just how much money I did have. I counterattacked by saying enough to send her back to finish her university courses, if she liked, adding that was about it. Of course, I had no idea how much that would have cost, but it was convincing and it made Cheryl change the subject. She insisted she had no intentions of being a social worker. Almost 2.5 hours passed before the two police officers showed up. They had brought some pictures for me to look at, and I picked out the dead rapist immediately. They asked if the other rapist was among any of the other pictures, but he wasn't. None even looked like the third man. On March 23rd, I got a call from the police asking if I would come down to the public safety building immediately. It was in the afternoon and Cheryl was out job hunting. There could only be one reason that they would want me there. They must have arrested the third man. After I got there, I had to wait for at least 45 minutes. Then, there in the lineup was the leader. He looked arrogant and unafraid. He looked evil. It gave me great pleasure to be able to pick him out so easily without any fear of being mistaken. At the same time, that cold chill came over me again. From the minute I saw him, I began to tremble, just as I had that night. Not being able to control myself scared me. I really feared the possibility of losing my mind, going crazy. In that way, rape was a double assault. Rapists abuse their victims both physically and mentally. Some victims' minds really did snap after a brutal sexual assault. Maybe it had something to do with what I tried during the assault, separate my mind from my body. I didn't know. I wasn't a psychologist. I just knew how I felt. I was driven home in a police car, and I was grateful for that. To be out alone, especially in the dark, was just too terrifying for me. Cheryl hadn't yet returned, so I again went through my ritual of trying to exorcise the evil within me by bathing. I poured half a bottle of perfumed oil into the hot water, and then spent the next hour scrubbing vigorously. When the water would get cold, I would just add more hot water. All the while, I thought of the rapists, laughing crazily, pawing at me, coming down on me, putting their smell on me, putting their dirt on me. And no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't get rid of the smell of their awful, slimy bodies, the awful memories. I wanted to scream aloud, that long, silent scream I kept in my head that night. I wanted them to feel my anguish. I wanted to gouge out their eyes. I wanted to whip the life out of them, mutilate them, kill them, because bathing never worked. I always got worked up like that whenever I would take a bath, although it had never been with such intensity before. Back in the bedroom, I paced the floor back and forth, cursing fate for having placed me on Elgin Street that night, cursing the judicial system because of those two. If they went to jail, they would get out again and rape again. When I had cooled down somewhat, I began wondering for the 100th time why they had kept on calling me a squaw. Was it obvious? That really puzzled me. Except for my long black hair, I really didn't think I could be mistaken as a native person. Mistaken? There's that shame again. Okay, identified. When Cheryl got home, I hadn't even started supper yet. We decided to order pizza and have it delivered. Cheryl had news that she was quite sure she was going to be hired at a downtown factory, where she'd put in an application that afternoon. She had to phone back that following Monday. I asked her what she would be doing because I couldn't see her working on an assembly line. She said she'd be doing a lot of different things, but she wouldn't specify. What a waste, I thought to myself. That started me thinking of opening our own business, maybe a fashion boutique like the ones I used to visit on Yonge Street and in the Yorkville area of Toronto. From my shopping experiences with Mrs. Radcliffe, I've learned a lot. Could I have learned more if I would have paid more attention? But Cheryl was what discouraged me. She would insist on drawing in Native women, which would drive others away. Moreover, Cheryl's heart wouldn't be in it. She dressed well enough for one of her crowd, but that certainly wasn't the world of high fashion. In the end, I thought that it would be best not to mention it. For the time being, I decided that I would go back to a temporary secretarial work because I I didn't want to be tied to a job until the whole rape trial ordeal was over. In April, Roger, Cheryl, and I went out to celebrate my birthday. It was only rarely we did anything together. Cheryl still hadn't brought over a single friend to our place. She went out a great deal. She would come home from work, have supper, change, and go out again. I spent more and more time with Roger. In May, I was cleaning the house on a Friday because I didn't have a job for that day. It was when I was collecting the garbage from Cheryl's room that I came across an empty whiskey bottle in her garbage container. I was so shocked to see it, the implication of it rushing into my head. Cheryl wouldn't do that. Sneak drinks. So why the bottle? I tried to think of a number of reasons why she'd have a bottle in her room. I'd never seen her even slightly drunk. Of course, we hadn't seen much of each other over the past few months. I decided I was making too much of it. We were getting along all right, and I didn't want to change that. Cheryl never did say anything to me, although she must have realized that I found the empty bottle when I had done the cleaning. A few weeks after this, I spotted a promotional piece in the newspaper about an Indian powwow to be held on July 1st long weekend at Roseau River. I thought that it would be good if Cheryl and I attended the festival, I thought. Especially good for Cheryl. Perhaps it would renew an interest in her native cause. That evening, as soon as Cheryl came home from work, I asked, "Hey, Cheryl, what's an Indian powwow?" "Oh, it's mostly a dancing competition among different tribes who come from all over the place." "Are they interesting?" "Oh, sure, I've been to several of them. I like going to them. Well, there's going to be one in Roseau on the July 1st weekend. I'd like to go to it and see what it's like. How about it? We could go buy some camping stuff and make it like we were teenagers again. Remember? You really want to go?" "Yeah, I said I did, didn't I?" "Okay, I'm glad you want to go. You'll finally rub shoulders with real Indians," Cheryl said, and I wasn't sure if she was happy or just being sarcastic. I was quite anxious to go, and then I thought of Roger's brother Joe. Funny that so many Indian boys were called Joe. Probably Catholic mothers naming their sons after Joseph, the foster father of Jesus. I wondered if Joe was married. Roger hadn't said. I thought maybe I should invite Roger to bring his brother and join us for the powwow. I'd have to ask him. I never did ask him, though. I had supper at his place not long after, and I was wondering how to broach the subject, but Roger had picked that night to decide it was high time we showed our affection for each other. During the past few weeks of seeing each other, I had subtly dissuaded him from even giving me a simple goodnight kiss. As far as I knew, Roger was most likely seeing other women, which was fine with me. Men, to my knowledge, did not tend to be celibate for long periods, and Roger and I were just good friends. But on this particular night, he kept getting uncomfortably close. At one point, I went over to look out the window, but he followed me. He made me turn to face him and was about to kiss me. I had an appointment on June 1st to see the Crown Attorney, Mr. Scott. I had already received a subpoena from the RCMP officer for the preliminary hearing. Mr. Scott's building was in the basement of the legislative building. The police had explained some of the general court procedures, but Mr. Scott explained things in more detail. For instance, as we went over my statement, he told me I was allowed to say things like I smelled liquor on his breath, but not he was drunk. It had to do with hearsay evidence. One could testify to what was directly known. Anyway, it was quite complicated to me, and I worried about messing up my testimony. I also worried about the defense counsel misconstruing whatever I would say. I had an appointment on June 1st to see the Crown Attorney, Mr. Scott. I had already received a subpoena from the RCMP officer for the preliminary hearing. Mr. Scott's office was in the basement of the legislative building. The police had explained some of the general court procedures, but Mr. Scott explained things in more detail. For instance, we went over my statement, he told me I was allowed to say things like I smelled liquor on his breath, but not he was drunk. It had more to do with hearsay evidence. One could testify to what was directly known. Anyways, it was quite complicated to me, and I worried about messing up my testimony. I also worried about the defense counsel misconstruing whatever I would say. On the day of the hearing, I went early to Mr. Scott's office as we were to meet there. As I went to the Stonewall, I reread my statement, which Mr. Scott handed me. He reminded me of a few things, and before I knew it, we were at the community hall in Stonewall, where the judicial process was carried out. Mr. Scott showed me to a small room where I was to wait until my turn to testify. But by lunchtime, I still hadn't been called, and I was both bored and apprehensive. After lunch, I went over my statement again, although I loathed going over those words that told the story of that night. I was finally called to give testimony, and I started shaking as soon as I heard my name. My stomach had been tied up in knots all day, but it tightened up even more by the time I was on the witness stand. Mr. Scott asked me to recount the events of January 11th of 1972. I did but minimize the dirty details as much as I could. On occasion, he'd have me go into some of those details, like the rape itself. I couldn't just say I'd been raped. I had to describe the act itself. I tried at all times to look only at his eyes or his lips as they moved, pretending I was talking only to him and that no one else was there. Of course, I could feel their eyes burning into me. I knew darn well that there were others in that room, listening to what I was saying. When that thought would overwhelm me, my voice would fade out, and the court stenographer would ask me to repeat myself. I wondered what those people were thinking. It wasn't just a simple matter that a horrible degradation had happened to me. The thing was, I had been part of it. I'm sure that's what they all thought, even if unwillingly. I had been part of that depraved sexual activity. I had known in advance that I would have to use explicit words when referring to private parts of the anatomy. And I had come across those words as well as the slang words in the past. But to me, to say them out loud in front of all those people, well, I faltered every time I had to say them. In the future, I would better understand why some women chose not to seek justice in the courtrooms. And then I was questioned by the defense counsel, Mr. Schneider. He sounded very skeptical, at times even sarcastic. He tried different insinuations, which made me feel defensive. I felt like it was me who was on trial by the time he was through with me. He persisted in making me go into depth about some incidents, and I really believed it was just to make me say those words that I had stuttered on. I understood full well that it was his job to defend his client in any way he could, but I also felt that what he did to me was morally wrong. A recess was called after I was allowed off the stand, and I headed straight for the washroom. Once there, I threw up. One woman who had been in there when I walked in, and she glanced at me. I couldn't interpret what was in her glance, but when she expressed sympathy, I broke down and I began crying. I wished for the moment that I could stay in the washroom until everyone was gone, but I had to go out to Mr. Scott's car. I fixed my makeup and braced myself and returned to the courtroom, very grateful that at least one person sympathized with me. The court ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed with the trial. That's what the preliminary hearing was for. The court also ordered a ban on the publication of evidence, for which I was extremely grateful. On our way back to Winnipeg, Mr. Scott was in good spirits because he had been successful. I was just relieved that this portion was over and done with. There was still the trial ahead. Cheryl and I left early Saturday morning for the Rousseau Reservation. There was a camping area set aside for the likes of us, and as we made our way to the main area, we noticed license plates from Montana, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and even Arizona. Men, women, and children were in traditional tribal costumes. Somewhere in the background, drums could be heard, sounding the heartbeat of the people. Teepees had been set up, and Indian women in buckskin dresses now tended to fires, making bannock for curious onlookers. The main event, as Cheryl had said, was a dancing competition. During the intervals, everyone was invited to participate in the dancing. Cheryl joined in, but I stayed on the sidelines. That night, we sat Indian style around a bonfire, listening to the chanting and the tales of the Indian singers. Cheryl told me that was probably how it had felt on those long ago buffalo hunts. I was impressed by all the sights and sounds. It went deeper than just hearing and seeing. I felt good. I felt alive. There were stirrings of pride, regret, and even an inner peace. For the first time in my life, I felt as if all of that was a part of me, as if I was a part of it. It was curious to feel that way. I had gone expecting to feel embarrassment, maybe even contempt. I looked over at Cheryl. She, too, seemed so relaxed. She was deep in conversation with some people on the other side of her. I didn't attempt to join their conversation. I was occupied with enjoying my own realizations. I also noted with satisfaction the old animation on Cheryl's face as she gestured and talked with her companions. Earlier that evening, an Indian family had set up their tent next to ours and had come over to offer help. At the end of the ceremonies, Cheryl and I returned to our tent. "Well, did you enjoy yourself?" Cheryl asked. "Oh, I don't know. In this atmosphere, everything is staged. It's romanticized. On Monday, we'll all go home, and to what? I'll go back to see the drunken Indians on Main Street, and I'll feel the same old shame. It's like having two worlds in my life that can't be mixed, and I've made my choice on how I want to live my everyday life. Yeah, but to the Indian blood that runs through your veins, April, to deny that, you deny a basic part of yourself. You'll never be satisfied until you can accept that fact. How do you do it, Cheryl? How is it that you're so proud when there's so much against being a Native person? For one thing, I don't see it that way. Maybe I have put too much faith in my dreams, but if alcohol didn't have such destructive force on us, we'd be a fabulous people. And that's what I see. I see all the possibilities that we have. Nancy, for instance, you never did think much of her when I was attending university, did you? Well, she does drink and does other things that you would never dream of doing. But she also holds a steady job, and she's been at minimum wage for a long time. They use her, and she knows it, and she gets depressed about it. But with the education and the way things are, she knows she doesn't have many choices. She helps support her mother and her sister and a brother. The reason why she left home in the first place was her father. He was an alcoholic who beat up her mother and raped Nancy. Okay, she doesn't have much. Maybe she never will have much, but what she's got, she shares with her family. And she's not an exception. I didn't know that, I said. We sat for a time in silence before I spoke again. When we lived with our parents, I used to take you to the park. The white kids would call the Native kids all sorts of names. If they had let us, I would have liked to play with the white kids, never the Native kids. To me, the white kids were the winners all the way. I guess what I feel today started back then. It would take an awful lot for me to be able to change what I've felt for a lifetime. Shame doesn't dissolve overnight. I can understand that. Me, I've been identifying with Native people ever since I was a kid. The Métis people share more of the same problems with the Indian people. I guess that's why Riel was leader to both. I wrote this piece in university, but they wouldn't publish it because it was too controversial. I still know it by heart. Want to hear it? Sure, I said. There was little in our conversation we hadn't discussed before, but sitting there in our tent, surrounded by proud Indians, everything seemed different. White man, to you my voice is like the unheard call in the wilderness. It is there, though you do not hear. But this once, take the time to listen to what I have to say. Your history is highlighted by your wars. Why is it all right for your nations to conquer each other in your attempts at dominion? When you sailed to our lands, you came with your advanced weapons. You claimed you were a progressive, civilized people. And today, white man, you have the ultimate weapons. Warfare which could destroy all men, all creation. And you allow such power to be in the hands of those few who have such little value and true wisdom. White man, when you first came, most of our tribes began with peace and trust in dealing with you, strange white intruders. We showed you how to survive in our homelands. We were willing to share with you our vast wealth. Instead of repaying us with gratitude, you, white man, turned on us, your friends. You turned on us with your advanced weapons and your cunning trickery. When we, the Indian people, realized your intentions, we rose to do battle, to defend our nations, our homes, our food, our lives. And for our efforts, we are labeled savages, and our battles are called massacres. And when our primitive weapons could not match those with which you had perfected through the centuries of war, we realized that peace could not be won unless our mass destruction took place. And so we turned to treaties. And this time we ran into your cunning trickery, and we lost our lands, our freedom, and were confined to reservations, and we are held in contempt. As long as the sun shall rise, for you, white man, these are words without meaning. White man, there is much in the deep, simple wisdom of our forefathers. We were here for centuries. We kept the land, the waters, the air clean and pure for our children and for our children's children. Now that you are here, white man, the rivers bleed with contamination. The winds moan with the heavy weight of the pollution in the air. The land vomits up the poisons which have been fed into it. Our Mother Earth is no longer clean and healthy. She is dying. White man, in your greedy rush for money and power, you are destroying. Why must you have power over everything? Why can't you live in peace and harmony? Why can't you share the beauty and the wealth which Mother Earth has given us? You do not stop at confining us to small pieces of rock and muskeg. Where are the animals of the wilderness to go when there is no more wilderness? Why are the birds of the skies falling to their extinction? Is there joy for you when you bring down the mighty trees of our forests? No living thing seems sacred to you. In the name of progress, everything is cut down, and progress means only profits. White man, you say that we are a people without dignity, but when we are sick, weak, hungry, poor, when there is nothing for us but death, what are we to do? We cannot accept a life which has been imposed on us. You say that we are drunkards, that we live for drinking, but drinking is a way of dying without enjoying life. You have given us many diseases. It is true that you have found immunizations for many of these diseases, but this was done more for your own benefit. The worst disease, for which there is no immunity, is the disease of alcoholism, and you condemn us for being its easy victims. And those who do not condemn us weep for us and pity us. So we, the Indian people, we are still dying. The land we lost is dying too. White man, you have our land now. Respect it, as we once did. Take care of it, as we once did. Love it, as we once did. White man, our wisdom is dying, as we are. But take heed, if Indian wisdom dies, you, white man, will not be far behind. So weep not for us, weep for yourselves, and weep for your children, for their children, because you are taking everything today, and tomorrow there will be nothing left for them. Cheryl had become more and more emotional as she went on. When she finished, we sat in silence. The only sounds were those of the crickets. Somewhere in the distance, a child was crying. Finally, I said, I can see why they said it was controversial. I think it's powerful. We sat in silence for a few more minutes. At the same time, though, I think you put too much blame on white men for everything. The Indian people did allow themselves to be treated like children. They should have stood up for their rights instead of letting them be walked on. You know what I mean? Yeah, Cheryl shot back in a challenging voice. Where did it get the Métis? But what exactly is it the Métis want? To live like Indians on reservations? To be dependent on the governments? And therefore, the white people? You once said the Métis people were an independent breed, freedom lovers. I still maintain that. But we don't have that kind of life, Cheryl added as an afterthought, because we don't have very many choices. Besides, that piece was mostly to warn those in control that they're going too fast. I'd like them to slow down. Let's enjoy life, give our children hope for tomorrow, and get rid of those bloody clouds of bombs hanging over us all.